Should African Americans vote Democratic? Well, we certainly saw from this last special election in Alabama that they voted for Doug Jones, a Democrat, over Roy Moore, something like 98%. And just before the election, you had an influx of African American leaders like Deval Patrick and others going down into Alabama and campaigning very openly, and there was money spent, and the Democratic Party really turned out the black vote in that state. Now, Roy Moore was a very bad and strange candidate who made extremely insulting comments and ridiculous comments, bizarre comments that, I mean, putting myself in the shoes of an African American, I would never in my wildest dreams have voted for Roy Moore. Talking about, nostalgia for the Confederacy. I mean, the guy had to have rocks in his head, just politically speaking. So I certainly get that, and I certainly get why African Americans voted for Barack Obama. There's a tribal pride, and rightfully, it was a great moment in American history for all of us that Obama was elected as the first openly African American president of the United States. This was a milestone. So, I mean, I understand that as well. But it does get into a broader issue here, one that transcends the exigencies of actual political figures and why they're supported. And that is generally and generically, why are African Americans supporting Democrats overall? And that's something that I find hard to fathom, because what exactly does the Democratic Party offer black people other than two things: welfare and abortion? I think that President Trump had a great outreach to black voters in the election. Even though he didn't capture a majority of the vote, he did better than Romney had done, and that McCain had done. Now, that may be because they voted for Barack Obama because of his race, but even putting that aside, there was potential there. There was promise there. And that is because Trump's message to the black community was positive and good, and it's a natural constituency for Trump. Let's be successful. Let's get into business. Let's lift ourselves up. Let's make money so we can have a government that reduces taxes and that lowers onerous regulations that keep us out of business. We're going to have a pro-business government. That's a message for black people. And it's certainly contrary to the Democrat message over the past 50 years, which is anti-business, high taxes. Those are policies that hurt black families. And then it gets into a more transcendent issues as well. We could go back to the 1960s, a time when, according to Democratic Secretary of Labor Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who wrote a great report on this topic, black families are intact. The black faith was intact. Black entrepreneurialism was moving up. And this was in the face of real racism, Jim Crow, where you'd have horrible, quotas against black people, and you couldn't go into a freaking restaurant in Washington, D.C. I mean, we don't really realize today, most people alive today don't realize the real ugliness of real racism. Had a phenomenon, for example, in the 1950s, where Ralph Bunche, a chief envoy appointed to the United Nations by President Dwight Eisenhower, who negotiated a peace agreement between Israel and the Arabs in 1949, the Rhodes Agreement. The man was a brilliant figure in world history. I mean, one of the few people in history who could say that. And yet, since he happened to be a black man, he could not go to a restaurant in Washington when he was being visited by a foreign delegation. I mean, it was that disgusting and that absurd, that kind of racism. And yet, in spite of that, the black community continued to move up. Black entrepreneurialism continued to thrive. The black family was intact. The black church was a great moral force that I would contend was responsible for saving the white church. And all of this was impeded And Moynihan predicted it in his book, in his paper, published in 1965, by left-wing ideas which nationalized welfare, ideas that particularly affected the black community, where people were basically given a stipend not to work. Women were given a stipend to get rid of their husbands, and then further monies to have more children. Thus you had families, young men growing up in families with no father. And I would say that it particularly targeted the black community. There were activist groups like Acorn and others who really went out and tried to get black people on welfare. This really started a launch in Nixon's administration, because Nixon transformed welfare to a system by which federal monies would be granted to these left-wing groups like Acorn, as opposed to being completely centrally run, which was the Lyndon Johnson approach. And the result was serious damage to the black community, black family. The black faith was undermined by left-wing anti-religious ideas, and abortion, and the promotion of other ideas that are antithetical to Christian belief. So we have a lean on the black faith, the black family, black entrepreneurialism with anti-business attitudes, and the result has been that the black families have been held back. The last line of defense really has turned out to be the beat officer, the policeman, who have to deal with the manifestations and the results of these bad left-wing democratic policies, which have created dependency and destruction. The other one is, of course, not white, but left-wing democratic approaches to education, which turned our young people into products rather than teaching them how to think cognitively and be independent by learning how to read properly with phonics and other methods. Instead, children have been forced to deal with these education modalities which have dumbed them down. And when you have a family without a father, the mother on welfare, the church has been compromised. There's no business opportunity. You have young people in these schools who are subjected more and influenced more by these despicable education modalities invented by the left to dumb people down. So the end result is that you've got young people, plus the introduction of drugs, lenient judges who allowed thugs and criminals to wander the streets and terrorize neighborhoods, something that would not be allowed in a white neighborhood, by the way. And the result is that you've got crime, you've got violence, you've got murder, you've got drug addiction, you've got poverty, and you've got a lack of employment. So you have men who are idle and who, have nothing to do but sell drugs. And now you have the policeman, who's the last line of defense, who's trying to go in and protect the community, the 98% of people who are trying to get to work every day and trying to go to school, from thugs, and they're under assault by groups like Black Lives Matter, which is financed by George Soros and other left-wing organizations. And so why, I would ask you, should blacks support their own self-destruction by liberal Democrats who have engaged in cynical politics, quite frankly, in the literal sense, racist politics, even though they may not think so and they may not mean it that way. And yet you've got somebody like Donald Trump, who's a natural leader for the African-American community, come along and say, hey, you could be like me. You could be a successful businessman. You can realize your life. You can take part of the American dream. You could become an entrepreneur. You could become educated and really, get the kind of education that helps you think cognitively and develop yourself and become creative and become imaginative and take and participate in all of the benefits and blessings of the American dream. I think that the black community has largely done that in spite of the left. They have risen up. They have entered into the middle and upper classes. It would have been a lot easier and a lot faster, and they would have assimilated into it a lot quicker had it not been for left-wing politics, but nevertheless, they have done it in many respects. but the lingering problems remain, and I would argue that those lingering problems are from the left. And what does the left offer the black community today? They're holding up a microscope and they're saying, aha, we have found a racist gene in someone because they looked this way, or they said this, or they moved that way. They must be secretly racist. And we're going to condemn them because of something not that they did or said, but because of what we argue as great scientists, it's something that they think. So you have an authoritarian, totalitarian approach that is just creating resentment and anger and division. I think that President Trump rejects that. I think that hopefully African Americans will become aware and they'll woke and they'll wake up and they'll say, hey, we've been screwed by the Democrats. It's time for us to move over and take our self-interest in hand and begin to participate in the American dream, become pro-business, support lowering taxes, support getting rid of onerous regulations, support America stopping illegal aliens coming in who are taking our jobs and who are criminalizing our neighborhood with drug gangs. Let's get with the program. Let's get back to the great traditions of the African American family, which were conservative, which were religious. Anyway, those are my thoughts today on the subject. Thanks for watching, everybody.